Good evening. Today's topic will be on inflammatory bowel disease. By definition, inflammatory bowel disease is an immune-mediated chronic intestinal condition. As we all know, it consists of two conditions, namely ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Epidemiology, why we should know inflammatory bowel disease? It's a disease which has been and is common among the Western world, mainly the Northern Europe, Northern America, with the highest incidence and prevalence in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And its prevalence is increasing in India and other Southeast Asian countries. Hence, we should know it. So, a few interesting points regarding the epidemiology is there's an increasing incidence among immigrants to UK, suggesting that some environmental factors may be responsible. And coming to the age, it has a bimodal incidence, most common between the second and fourth decades and between the seventh and ninth decades of life. It is equal in male and females. 25% of the cases come under pediatric IBD, and two terms, namely very early onset IBD is onset of IBD less than 6 years, and if the onset is less than 2 years, it's called as infantile IBD. Though these two are commonly termed as inflammatory bowel disease, there is always some significant differences between the behavior of these two diseases. Few similarities is both have nearly the equal incidence, around 20 per 1 lakh population, and both have nearly the same ethnicity, with Asian population getting least affected, and both affect males and females equally. With the same age group, a few differences include smoking will prevent ulcerative colitis, but smoking will increase Crohn's disease. Oral contraceptive pills has a better association with Crohn's disease compared to ulcerative colitis. And appendicectomy will be protective for ulcerative colitis and it's not protective for Crohn's disease. Antibiotic use, infections in childhood, all these are common risk factors for both. But smoking, oral contraceptives, and appendicectomy, the behavior of these two diseases will be different. So, to understand IBD and its treatment better, we should know the basics. Normal intestine, as we all know, it contains so much of microorganisms. It is continuously exposed to antigens. But still, in spite of these two factors, there is no excess immunity which is stimulated. So why no immunity is stimulated despite the intestine being exposed to so many microorganisms and so many foreign antigens is due to the function of regulatory T cells, which inhibits excess immune response to these factors. So for that, we need a transcription factor called as FOXP3. When this balance is affected, we get inflammatory bowel disease. So the four terms which you have to remember in the pathogenesis of IBD is in a predisposed individual. By the term predisposed, I means the patient has some genetic factor which is causing him to get IBD. The presence of environmental factors, namely the diet, or gut dysbiosis, the thing I mentioned as microbiota, which stimulate an immune response which is abnormal. So these four terms, a predisposed individual, if the environmental and factors and gut dysbiosis is provoking an immune response, it leads to inflammatory bowel disease. So this is what I was mentioning. In spite the gut contains so many microorganisms and is exposed to so many environmental factors, there's no excess immunity which is stimulated. If there's an immune response which is getting generated to this microbial flora and all these environmental factors, which leads to an immune dysregulation, that too in a susceptible individual, it leads to the spectrum of inflammatory bowel disease. So in the end, everything depends on genetics, everything depends on immunity. So all the genes or all the factors which mediate immunity or inflammation will be involved here. So same thing which I told you, it could be a familial disease or a sporadic disease. Environmental factors, genetic factors, and body's immune factors and microbiota play a role. So we'll discuss each of these factors. So genetic factors, there are some problem with the genetics which is causing excess inflammation or immunity, like interleukin 10 or interleukin 10 receptor mutations, CTLA4, it's a factor involving T lymphocyte activation, NCF2, XIAP, LRBA, TTC7. So all these proteins or genes are needed for normal immune regulation. If this becomes excessive or abnormal, we get inflammatory bowel disease. So 10% of the cases are only familial, the remaining are sporadic. To identify the familial cases, we use something called as genome-wide association studies. Some consider inflammatory bowel disease to be an autoimmune disease. So it is associated with some other autoimmune diseases also, like rheumatoid arthritis. This is the whole list of genes which is associated with inflammatory bowel disease, not going into the detail. Just in short, any gene which is dealing with innate immunity, adaptive immunity, inflammation or immunity, if it is abnormal, it leads to inflammatory. It predisposes to inflammatory bowel disease. When we speak of genetics, we should also speak of genetic syndromes. Some syndromes like Turner syndrome, Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome, Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome, glycogen storage diseases, something called as IPEX, immune dysregulation, polyendocrinopathy, enteropathy, and X-linked disease. All these are associated with genetics. A simple clinical clue is any IBD which is occurring in the pediatric age group. Always think of genetic association. So the one factor we have discussed. So the genetic predisposition we have discussed. Now the second thing is microbiota. The gut microbiota consists of 1,000 species of bacteria. The total number being 10 raised to the 12 colony forming units. This microbiota is achieved by 3 years of age. It is unique to one particular individual. Since the person is exposed to this microbiota since very young age, since 3 years of age, normally immune response is not getting generated. When immune response is not getting generated, we call that term as anergy. Breakage of anergy leads to inflammation or inflammatory bowel disease. So NOD2 is a protein which is needed for that. Dysbiosis is loss of microbes. So I told you the normal microbes present in the intestine will prevent inflammation. So loss of microbes that hinder inflammation, or new microbes are getting added to the intestine which can stimulate inflammation. This is called as dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is one important factor for many of the GI diseases, one among them being inflammatory, and the most important among them being inflammatory bowel disease. So we discussed genetics, we have discussed microbiota. I'm not discussing the environmental factors. The last and the most important thing is defective immune regulation. So the one which I told, though there are so many bacteria present, though we take so many antigens, because of a phenomenon called as tolerance or anergy in the oral cavity or in the mucosa, GI mucosa, immunity is not getting stimulated excessively. If this anergy is broken, we get inflammation. So again, interleukin 10, interleukin 35, TGF beta, these are anti-inflammatory cytokines. If these are lost, we get inflammatory bowel disease. So again, the same basic excess activation of pro-inflammatory mediators or inactivation of anti-inflammatory mediators stimulates an inflammatory cascade. The next step of inflammation will be immunity. So this is the final summary of what happens. Though there are so many bacteria, the intestinal epithelial cells do not stimulate an immune response. But change in dysbiosis, that is, we are adding new organisms, or we are deleting the excessive organisms, or we are giving so many oral antigens, the immunity gets stimulated. We all know the sequence which happens. Any inflammation is stimulated by the neutrophils or antigen presenting cells, dendrocytes, macrophages which come in. So the neutrophils, macrophages, they secrete cytokines such as TNF alpha, interleukin 1. All these stimulate more of lymphocytes to come into the picture. The first lymphocytes which come in are T helper cells. T helper cells consist of 3 main subsets. They are Th1, Th2 and Th17. Th1 is the main T helper cell which stimulates cell-mediated immunity, and it acts through interferon gamma. Th2 type of helper cells, it secretes interleukin 4, interleukin 5 and interleukin 13. Rather than cell-mediated immunity, it mainly stimulates a B-cell mediated immunity or antibody-mediated immunity. Th17 type of helper cells is mainly anti-inflammatory. It secretes TGF beta, which helps in ending the inflammation. So once again, I'm telling, inflammation begins with neutrophil, macrophages or dendritic cells, which secrete so many cytokines such as TNF alpha, interleukin 1, interleukin 6, which cause influx of T helper cells into the picture. T helper cells can be 3 types: Th1, Th2 or Th17. Th1 mainly mediates cell-mediated immunity by interferon gamma. Th2 stimulates B-cell mediated immunity by interleukin 4, 5 or 13. Th17 cells secrete TGF beta and other anti-inflammatory mediators to end the inflammatory process. So when the Th1 response or Th2 response increases, or when the Th17 response decreases, we have some amount of inflammation going on. It is said that excess activation of Th1 leads to Crohn's disease. Excess activation of Th2 leads to ulcerative colitis. And loss of Th17 is common in both. Hence, the therapeutic targets will be different. So if you know this pathway, at least in short, we can think about the drugs which can be given to prevent this. I told you in the first step, macrophages are neutrophils. They secrete interleukin 1, interleukin 6, and TNF. So inhibitors of all these things, like TNF alpha inhibitors, we know the infliximab, adalimumab, certolizumab, etc. They can be used in treatment. Interleukin 6 inhibitors also have a role, like tocilizumab, ustekinumab, etc. So these act on the receptors to stimulate TH response. So the basic is this. So if inhibiting interferon 1 gamma through certain drugs, Crohn's disease will be inhibited. So the same basic. Okay, so having completed the basics of what happens, now the basic difference between Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Harrison describes under these headings: macroscopic features, microscopic features, clinical features, complications. In Crohn's disease, the entire thing, just remembered few terminologies. One, Crohn's disease is a transmural disease, whereas ulcerative colitis is a mucosal disease. Transmural by, I mean, Crohn's disease, the pathology involves the mucosa, submucosa, the muscle layer, and the serosa. Now, since Crohn's disease involves everything, the risk of perforation is more with Crohn's disease. The risk of a full thickness stenosis is common with Crohn's disease. Whereas ulcerative colitis, it involves only the mucosa. Hence, perforation or stenosis is rare, but other complications can occur. Crohn's disease can occur along the entire length of GIT, the commonest area involved being ileum and colon, ileocolitis. Ulcerative colitis, as the name suggests, it involves only the colon. The commonest site of involvement being the sigmoid colon and the descending colon. So these are the few things which you have to remember. So I'll just summarize the other thing. Crohn's disease can occur along anywhere in the GIT, whereas ulcerative colitis almost always involves the rectum and the entire colon. And another important feature is Crohn's disease does not involve the entire GIT fully. We have something called as skip lesions. Few areas are involved, few areas are normal. Ulcerative colitis, it doesn't have a skip lesion. It involves the entire part of the colon fully. So since Crohn's disease is a full thickness lesion, the wall appearance will be thick in Crohn's disease. It will be thin in ulcerative colitis. Stricture will be present in Crohn's disease. Stricture will be absent in ulcerative colitis. This is somewhat an MCQ. The earliest change in Crohn's disease will be an aphthous ulcer. Earliest change in ulcerative colitis will be the blurring of mucosal stripe and granular appearance. So microscopically, the same thing we have: transmural inflammation in Crohn's, mucosal inflammation in ulcerative colitis. So deep ulcers in Crohn's, superficial ulcers in ulcerative colitis. Pseudopolyps usually occur with ulcerative colitis. Fibrosis usually occurs with Crohn's disease. And granulomas are present in Crohn's disease. So clinical feature, applying the same microscopy and macroscopy, we have something called as cobblestone appearance, string sign due to stenosis, and halo sign in Crohn's disease. In ulcerative colitis, since the length of colon is involved, we have a finding called as pipe stem colon. Stenosis is more common with Crohn's disease. Malignant change is less common, whereas malignant change is more common with ulcerative colitis. Toxic megacolon is more common with ulcerative colitis. And this again come to this point later. ASCA antibodies associated with Crohn's disease, ANCA antibodies associated with ulcerative colitis, PANCA. So again, just a small mnemonic: cobblestone appearance, high temperature, reduced lumen, I mean fibrosis, fistulae, skip lesion, transmural involvement. Since the intestine is involved, malabsorption occurs with Crohn's disease, but the presentation in ulcerative colitis will be different. Submucosal fibrosis, all this occurs with Crohn's disease. This is a diagrammatic representation. So you can see the skip involvement. The ileum and colon is the common site of involvement. Stricture occurs more commonly in Crohn's disease. Patchy inflammation occurs. Whereas in ulcerative colitis, the entire length of colon, that's called pipe stem colon involvement, is commonly seen in ulcerative colitis. But the baseline characters are the same. Male and female are equally affected with the bimodal distribution of second and third decade and fifth and sixth decade. Since the site of involvement is different, the presentation also differs. Since the ileum is commonly involved in Crohn's disease, the presentation will be a malabsorption like diarrhea, steatorrhea, weight loss, fatigue. Whereas in ulcerative colitis, the site of involvement is being mainly the colon. We have some other symptoms like large bowel diarrhea, mucus in stool, blood in stools, abdominal pain, crampy abdominal pain, etc. Malnutrition more common with Crohn's disease. Okay, so this is the entire basics of that whole chapter. We'll just revise the same things again. So what happens in ulcerative colitis? I told you large bowel is getting involved, colon is getting involved. So we have diarrhea, rectal bleeding, tenesmus. Tenesmus is the feeling of incomplete evacuation of stools, passage of mucus, and crampy abdominal pain. Again, the symptoms vary from mild symptoms to very acute severe presentation. Constipation can occur because of distal colonic involvement. Severe disease can initially present itself with a bloody diarrhea with severe pus and mucus. And the diarrhea here will be nocturnal or postprandial. Apart from this, we have some systemic symptoms like anorexia, nausea, vomiting, and fever. And on examination, since the distal rectum is always involved, we'll have a tender perectal examination, tender colon. And one important complication of ulcerative colitis will be a toxic megacolon. When the colon increases in size, we'll lose the we'll not have hepatic dullness in the right hypochondrium. We'll have a tympanic node. This was discussed in examination class also. So toxic megacolon, the feature we'll be having is hepatic tympany. Once you are having a hepatic tympany in ulcerative colitis, the next complication which you have to expect is you can have a rupture of a toxic megacolon. Now the patient can go in for peritonitis with guarding and rigidity. So this is the sequence which you should expect. Initially, there will be only tender anal canal and tender colon. It can lead to hepatic tympany and peritonitis. So symptoms are over. Complications can be acute or chronic. I told you 1 to 3% of individuals can itself present with a severe presentation like a massive hemorrhage. The hemorrhage is so massive that patient may need 6 to 8 units of blood transfusion in 24 hours. That is a massive transfusion and it's an indication for surgery, colectomy. And toxic megacolon is another complication occurring 5% of individual. It's triggered by electrolyte abnormalities like hypokalemia and narcotic drugs, which leads to hepatic tympany. Once the toxic megacolon occurs, the next thing you have to expect is a rupture. Perforation is rare, but once it occurs, it has a 15% mortality. The thing is, the patients with ulcerative colitis usually will be taking steroids. Steroids increases the risk of perforation, but steroids reduces the clinical manifestation of perforation. So be careful in this aspect. Strictures can occur, which is less likely compared to Crohn's disease. A stricture occurring in ulcerative colitis, always think of malignancy. Others include fissures, perianal abscess, and hemorrhoids. Fistula involvement in ulcerative colitis as such is rare compared to Crohn's disease, as I mentioned. But if it occurs, because of the site of involvement, it can form a fistula with the bladder. That's called intravesical fistula. Features in this will be dysuria, hematuria, fecaluria, and recurrent bladder infection. If it goes into the skin, intracutaneous fistula can occur and intravaginal fistula. Remember, this is common. These fistula can occur in ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, more with Crohn's disease. So again, Crohn's disease, I told you the site of involvement is different, hence the manifestation is also different. So you can have either a fibrostenotic pattern of involvement or a fistulous pattern of involvement. Fistula, I mentioned, what will be the manifestation. Stenosis, as you know, will present with subacute or a chronic intestinal obstruction. So the site of involvement determines the symptom. I told you ileocolitis is the most common clinical manifestation of Crohn's disease. So when the ileum or colon is involved, we'll have malabsorption with the right lower quadrant mass. So recurrent episodes of right lower quadrant pain with diarrhea. And systemic symptoms will be more common with Crohn's disease like fever, weight loss, etc. And patient may have dysuria. Right iliac fossa symptoms can mimic appendicitis. And the characteristic feature here is pain precedes defecation and is relieved by defecation. And bowel obstruction can occur not only due to fibrostenosis. Initial edema itself can cause intermittent bowel obstruction and postprandial pain. And fibrostenosis leads to bowel obstruction. Ileocolitis is the common presentation. Suppose if the jejunum or ileum is involved, rather than a right iliac fossa mass, malabsorption will be the prime feature here. Malabsorption steatorrhea with the systemic manifestations of hypoalbuminemia, hypocalcemia, leading to osteopenia and unexplained fractures, hypomagnesemia, coagulopathy, hyperoxaluria. This point I'll come again later. Hyperoxaluria in malabsorption leads to nephrolithiasis. So any patient with unexplained gallstones and unexplained renal stones with the background of bowel symptoms, always think of some malabsorption syndrome Crohn's disease being one among the differential diagnoses. Colitis as such is rare in Crohn's disease, but if it occurs, it almost always involves the anus. So anal fissures, perianal tracts will be the common manifestation. And diarrhea, crampy abdominal pain, hematochezia, the presentation will be similar to ulcerative colitis, but it will not be as gross as ulcerative colitis. And toxic megacolon is rare. So a colonic involvement with the bowel obstruction, think of Crohn's disease. A colonic involvement with the toxic megacolon or perforation, think of ulcerative colitis. Colon, the fistula can open into the stomach or duodenum, leading to fecal and vomiting. There can be incontinence, anal stricture, anorectal fistula, perianal abscess, hemorrhoids, etc. Gastroduodenal disease again is less common, but gastroduodenal symptoms, as we all know, the UGA symptoms, nausea, vomiting, epigastric pain, UGA bleeding can occur. So the catch here will be patient will have gastritis, but H. pylori will be negative. But gastroduodenal involvement will usually be secondary to a large bowel involvement like fistula, etc. Primary presentation will be rare. So in Crohn's disease, the presentation and symptoms vary according to the site, either ileocolitis, which leads to a right iliac fossa mass, or an appendicitis-like presentation, jejunoileitis with a malabsorption presentation, colitis with an ulcerative colitis-like presentation, and a gastritis-like presentation, gastroduodenal disease. Complication, perforation due to transmural involvement, intra-abdominal and pelvic abscess, massive hemorrhage, malabsorption, stenosis, the complications. So investigations are common for both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Being an immune-related disease, ESR, CRP will be elevated. Platelet count is also an acute phase reactant, so it increases. Due to chronic malabsorption, patient will have anemia. And one marker which suggests that there's an inflammation, is going on within the bowel is fecal lactoferrin or fecal calprotectin. These two are proteins which are present in neutrophils. So presence of fecal neutrophils with the fecal lactoferrin and calprotectin suggests that the patient is having an inflammatory bowel disease, and it suggests that patient may not have some other cause, some other differential diagnosis, and hypoalbuminemia is seen. So as in the investigation of any GI disease, as was discussed in the first class, we do blood investigations first, we do fecal investigations next, and the final confirmation will be either an imaging like CT or MR enterography and a direct visualization and biopsy of the GIT. So ulcerative colitis, a sigmoidoscopy or colonoscopy will be preferred. UGScopy has less value because I told you gastroduodenal involvement is less likely with Crohn's disease. So it is better to go for a wireless capsule endoscopy. So we can visualize the lesions. We can look for after ulcers in Crohn's disease. We can look for mucosal granularity in ulcerative colitis. We can do a biopsy, which can confirm the diagnosis. And non-invasively, a CT or MR enterography has a role in Crohn's disease to identify fistulas, to identify stenosis, etc. And for both the diseases, follow-up can be done with MR enterography. We can look for mucosal edema, etc. And I already told you, Crohn's disease, HSCA antibodies are positive, anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody, and p-ANCA antibody seen with ulcerative colitis. Some other antibodies also seen in Crohn's disease, apart from HSCA, ALCA, ACCA, and SMCA. So again, the final summary. I'm just highlighting the important points. Presence of gross blood in stools with mucus, one of the differential diagnoses should be ulcerative colitis. A mass in abdomen, appendicitis-like presentation, think of Crohn's disease commonly. A chronic disease presenting with small intestinal obstruction, response to antibiotics, always think of Crohn's disease. A toxic megacolon, hepatic tympani, perforation peritonitis, think of ulcerative colitis. So in endoscopy, cobblestone, continuous disease seen in ulcerative colitis, the pipe stem involvement which I told you. Crohn's disease will be skip lesion with after ulceration. Radiographically, the role is more towards a Crohn's disease because we can identify fistula, we can identify chronic fibrosis, whereas radiography has a lesser role in ulcerative colitis. Only pipe stem colon is the finding which we see. So once we have clinically thought of an ileocolitis-like presentation, a colitis-like presentation, or a gastroduodenal disease, before ruling in inflammatory bowel disease, we have to rule out other differential diagnoses. So what are the differential diagnoses of colitis? Colitis or ileitis in that sense. Maybe an infectious disease, non-infectious disease, a drug-induced or an atypical colitis. This is the same differential diagnosis which we'll be discussing throughout GIT. So infections, the differential diagnosis of ulcerative colitis is any infection which can cause a bloody diarrhea. So Campylobacter colitis, Salmonellosis, Shigellosis, Yersinia enterocolitica, Clostridium difficile, all EHEC, enterohemorrhagic E. coli, enteroinvasive E. coli, enteroaggregative E. coli, all these commonly cause a bloody diarrhea as a manifestation. If this is acute, think of infections also. So specific investigations should be targeted again. This I'm not going into the details. If the patient has some abnormal sexual behavior, think of gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis are also as differential diagnosis because proctitis is common here. And proctitis is the definitive feature of ulcerative colitis. TB can be a differential diagnosis, especially in the right iliac fossa mass because ileocolon is the common site where TB also occurs. So herpes simplex, cytomegalovirus can be differential diagnosis in colitis. In the immunosuppressed individual, think of Isospora belli, Entebima histolytica. Other worm infestations like hookworm, whipworm, Strongylides tuberculosis, all these also commonly involve the rectum. Candidiasis, aspergillosis, and disseminated histoplasmosis. So any infection which is causing a bloody diarrhea, any infection which is causing a thickening of the ileocolic region should be a differential diagnosis. So non-infectious causes, again the DD mostly correlates with ulcerative colitis. We have a condition in old age called as diverticulosis, which again commonly occurs in sigmoid colon. Inflammation of the diverticulosis is called as diverticulitis. It can also present like an ulcerative colitis. Ischemic colitis, again, since the watershed area is in the junction of transverse colon or at the level of splenic flexure, patient can have a large bowel diarrhea with mucus and crampy abdominal pain in ischemic colitis also. A few history points towards ischemic colitis as a probable etiology, like vascular conditions like history of aortic aneurysm repair, some hypercoagulable state, a cardiovascular or peripheral vascular disease points more in favor of an ischemic colitis. And comparing to ulcerative colitis, which usually has an indolent onset, ischemic colitis has a sudden onset. So patient with such a history like abdominal aneurysm repair, followed by that the patient is having a sudden onset of left lower quadrant pain, urgency to defecate and passing bright red blood per rectum, think of ischemic colitis. Since radiation injury will be a differential diagnosis of Crohn's disease because of transmural involvement, but it will not be like a skip lesion. So the place where we are giving radiation, that entire region will be stenotic. That will be the difference. So mucosal features and biopsy will help to distinguish. We have something called a solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. Ulcerative colitis will cause an ulcer. Solitary rectal ulcer syndrome will also cause an ulcer. The solitary rectal ulcer syndrome is due to a mechanical condition, due to an increased intrarectal pressure in chronic constipation. It can be single or multiple, and the site is usually characteristic. It occurs usually anteriorly or anterolaterally, whereas in ulcerative colitis, the site will be usually posterior. So infections we have discussed. Non-infectious causes will be diverticulitis, ischemic colitis for ulcerative colitis, and radiation injury for Crohn's disease. And drug-related colitis. Remember 4 drugs. NSAIDs can cause colitis as such. NSAID suppositories can cause proctitis, mimicking ulcerative colitis. And NSAID intake can cause reactivation of inflammatory bowel disease. So the confusion always comes whether the NSAID has caused a colitis as such or the NSAID has reactivated an underlying IBD. Again, how to differentiate fecal calprotectin, etc. can be of use. Ipilimumab is a drug. It can cause colitis. It is treated with glucocorticoid and infliximab. So the treatment is same compared to IBD. Mycophenolate mofetil is a commonly used immunosuppression. It can cause colitis. So the treatment is reduce the dose or stop the drug. No other drugs like steroids are needed. Etanercept is again a TNF alpha blocker. It is used in the treatment of IBD, but it itself can cause DNO, CD, and ulcerative colitis. So at least remember 2 important drugs, which are NSAID, which can itself cause colitis, which can cause reactivation of IBD. Etanercept, which can be used for the treatment of IBD, it itself can cause IBD. So So the fourth differential diagnosis set will be atypical colitis. We have two types of atypical colitis. One is collagenous colitis and lymphocytic colitis. As the name suggests, collagenous colitis, the biopsy will reveal more of increased subepithelial collagen and intraepithelial lymphocytes. But unlike IBD, it is more common in females and more common in the older age. So in younger age disease, think of IBD. A bit older age, think of other differential diagnosis. Some similarities also, like NSAIDs, beta blockers, smoking, proton pump inhibitors, other autoimmune diseases can aggravate collagenous colitis. Manifestation will be a chronic watery diarrhea. Whether IBD or collagenous colitis, the treatment will not be different. The same treatment for both sulfasalazine, mesalazine, diphenoxylate for diarrhea, bismuth, prednisolone, and azathioprine. Lymphocytic colitis is similar to collagenous colitis, but we do not get the subepithelial collagen. Only intraepithelial lymphocytes are present. Again, equal for male and female incidence. Apart from the drugs discussed above, beta blockers, NSAIDs, PPI, sertraline is also an risk factor for lymphocytic colitis. Lymphocytic colitis increases the risk of celiac disease. Treatment is similar to celiac disease. Give a gluten-free diet. So collagenous colitis treated similar to IBD. Lymphocytic colitis treated similar to celiac disease. Before continuing, I'll close this link and restart a new link. 40 minutes time is going to be over. Okay, continuing. So far we have discussed what is the main pathology which is occurring in inflammatory bowel disease, difference between UC and CD, the basic difference in clinical manifestation, and how to proceed with the investigation. Now, one important feature of inflammatory bowel disease is it is associated with so many extraintestinal manifestations. The extraintestinal manifestations clinically can be divided into two categories. One is either they are associated with IBD itself and they predict the severity of the disease. There are also another category of extraintestinal manifestation which is not associated with the severity of IBD. I'll tell that in the subsequent slides. So the dermatological manifestations in IBD will be an erythema nodosum, which occurs more with Crohn's disease, 10% in ulcerative colitis. Pyoderma gangrenosum, some Pyoderma vegetans, Pyostomatitis vegetans, Sweet syndrome, which is neutrophilic leukocytosis, metastatic Crohn's disease, psoriasis, perianal skin tag, which I discussed in Crohn's disease, and stomatitis. So among all the dermatological manifestations, Pyoderma gangrenosum is more common and more important. It usually occurs with ulcerative colitis. But as I mentioned, even though Pyoderma gangrenosum occurs in ulcerative colitis, it does not predict the severity of ulcerative colitis, and it does not correlate with the disease activity also. That is to say, the patient will not have any bowel symptoms. The patient would have had a perfectly controlled ulcerative colitis, but still he can have a Pyoderma gangrenosum. And Pyoderma gangrenosum can occur years before the patient develops bowel symptoms. So be careful when you see a case of Pyoderma gangrenosum. So usually occurs after bowel symptoms in Pyoderma gangrenosum. Sorry, I was wrong in that point. Pyoderma gangrenosum usually occurs after occurrence of bowel symptoms. It responds poorly to colectomy. It commonly occurs in the legs. It indicates severe disease. And the treatment being IV antibiotics, steroids, dapsone, azathioprine, thalidomide, cyclosporin, infliximab, and adalimumab. So treatment is similar to ulcerative colitis. Sorry, I was wrong here. Pyoderma gangrenosum correlates with the disease activity. So rheumatological manifestations being the common thing which we know, reactive arthritis. So asymmetric migratory polyarthritis, usually involving the lower limb joints, most commonly occurs with Crohn's disease. So how to treat it? It again correlates with the bowel activity. So treating the bowel inflammation will treat the reactive arthritis. And treatment for any arthritis, we usually give immunosuppressants, which is the same treatment in IBD. So that won't be a major difference. And colectomy in ulcerative colitis cures arthritis. So another manifestation will be ankylosing spondylitis, again more common with Crohn's disease. But unlike a polyarthritis or a reactive arthritis, Ankylosing spondylitis does not correlate with bowel activity, and it may require anti-TNF therapy specifically. Sacroiliitis occurs in both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. The sacroiliitis here, I mean sacroiliitis without ankylosing spondylitis. It also has no relation to bowel activity. Apart from that, hypertrophic osteoarthritis. So one GI condition causing clubbing will be inflammatory bowel disease. That to HOA, grade 4 or grade 5 clubbing. Relapsing polychondritis and pelvic and femoral osteomyelitis. Remember, osteopenia is a common feature of IBD because of calcium malabsorption, but osteomyelitis can also occur irrespective of osteopenia. So ocular manifestation, like any autoimmune disease, we can have conjunctivitis, iritis, and episcleritis. Iritis will need topical antibiotic, episcleritis will need systemic steroids, and ocular manifestations have no relation to bowel activity. So skin lesions have a relation to bowel activity, rheumatological ocular have no relation to bowel activity. And hepatobiliary manifestation, this will be somewhat important because any investigation of GI disease will almost always involve evaluation of the liver also. Hepatic steatosis can occur with CDR-UC. Cholelithiasis can occur with Crohn's disease. The reason I mentioned earlier, any distal bowel involvement will cause impaired bile acid reabsorption. When bile acid reabsorption is impaired, the liver responds by secreting more bile. More bile includes more bile stones. And primary sclerosing cholangitis, this is an important disorder because 5% of patients with ulcerative colitis have primary sclerosing cholangitis. But think in the reverse, 50 to 70% of patients with the primary sclerosing cholangitis have inflammatory bowel disease. The thing here is, it has no relation to bowel activity. So any patient coming with the presentation of jaundice, cirrhosis, etc., and you diagnose them to be a primary sclerosing cholangitis, even though they do not have any bowel symptom, always expect for the presence of ulcerative colitis, which can develop in future. Not only you can expect an ulcerative colitis, the patient can develop gallbladder cancer. So any gallbladder polyp occurring in the background of primary sclerosing cholangitis, it can turn out to be highly malignant. So always do a annual ultrasound surveillance for a gallbladder cancer. So diagnosis, so name suggests that's a sclerosing of the bile ducts. The intrahepatic bile ducts go for stenosis. Bile is not getting secreted. Bile accumulates within the liver. It causes liver cell damage, which leads to cirrhosis. So PSC is nothing but a chronic liver disease or a cirrhosis. The pathology which is beginning with the intrahepatic bile vessels. So since the bile vessels are going for bile ducts are going for stenosis, endoscopic stenting is the treatment of choice. ERCP or MRCP is the diagnosis of choice. Eventually, they go for liver cell failure requiring a liver transplantation. So as I already mentioned, gallbladder cancer can occur with the primary sclerosing cholangitis. Colon cancer is again more common with the primary sclerosing cholangitis. And other disorders being granulomatous hepatitis, hepatic amyloidosis can occur. Urological calculi, as discussed, hyperoxaluria. Normally, calcium binds to dietary oxalate and is excreted in stools. In malabsorption, fat is not getting absorbed. So the excess fat binds with the calcium in the GIT, leaving oxalate free. The oxalate gets absorbed into the blood and causes renal stones, hyperoxaluria. And ileal bladder fistula, common in Crohn's disease. The manifestation which we discussed, dysuria, hematuria, fecaluria, etc. And bone disease, which I discussed, low bone mass. So the low bone mass can occur due to Crohn's disease itself due to calcium malabsorption, and steroid, cyclosporin, methotrexate, total parenteral nutrition which we give. The chronic inflammation itself can cause osteopenia. In later stages can cause osteonecrosis. Thromboembolic disorders, venous and arterial hypercoagulation is common, vasculitis is common. And since it is considered to be an autoimmune disease, any other autoimmune disease manifestation like serositis, endocarditis, myocarditis, interstitial lung disease, amyloidosis can occur. Pancreatitis can occur. The reasons being gallstone which is forming can obstruct the ampulla. Duodenal fistula, ampullary Crohn's disease can occur. Primary sclerosing cholangitis can cause pancreatitis. Being an autoimmune disease, autoimmune pancreatitis itself can be associated with IBD. A Crohn's disease of pancreas, which is less likely. So these are the differential diagnoses. So Summarizing all the extraintestinal manifestation, skin, think of pyoderma gangrenosum, which correlates with bowel activity. Reactive arthritis, which correlates with bowel activity. Ankylosing spondylitis, sacroiliitis, clubbing, which does not correlate with bowel activity. Primary sclerosing cholangitis, which in future may need liver transplantation, which does not correlate with bowel activity. So treatment will be discussed under the following headings. Treatment, remember, we have an induction phase and a maintenance phase. Being an immune-related disorder, we are going to suppress the immune system. In the initial phases, since the inflammation and immunity is so florid that we need intensive induction phase. And once that induction is completed, we maintain the immunosuppression. That is the basic. So among all this, few drugs can help in induction, few drugs can help in maintenance, few drugs can help in both. Few drugs work in ulcerative colitis, few drugs work in Crohn's disease, few drugs help in both. So we need a better drug which acts in both CD and UC, which is useful in both induction phase and maintenance phase. We'll discuss that later. So remember the same hierarchy. 5-alpha salicylic acid based regimen, steroids, antibiotics, immunosuppressants, biologicals, and newer drugs. Later stage, we go for surgery. So 5-aminosalicylic acid based regimen, this is a historical regimen because the initial treatment of IBD started with these drugs. So the terms which I mentioned you, it induces and maintains remission, but it is used only in ulcerative colitis. So the mechanism of action is PPAR gamma mediated decrease in nuclear factor kappa B, nuclear localization. It reduces immunity. Just remember that point. So the drugs which are used are sulfasalazine is the prototype drug. Remember you have ASA. So 5-ASA or mesalamine. Mesalamine is actually the active form. It comes as a drug as such, but sulfasalazine gets converted to mesalamine. It bypasses the small intestine, goes into the colon and acts in the colon. Hence only it's used in ulcerative colitis. Given along with folic acid supplements, the dose is 2 to 4.58 grams per day of ASA is needed. Remember the term sulfa. So it contains more of sulfonamide moiety. So a patient with sulfonamide allergy may not be safe with this drug. Hence, sulfa-free aminosalicylate formulations were devised to overcome this side effect. The drugs being balsalicide, Delsicol, Asacol, Lialda, Apriso, Pentasa, Salafolk, Roasa, and this can be given systemically. And we have something called as Roasa enema, Canasa suppositories. All this locally act on the rectum and sigmoid colon. So side effects of ASA-based regimen will be headache, anorexia, nausea, vomiting, rash, fever, hepatitis. At least remember hepatitis, agranulocytosis, hypersensitivity. Few drugs use dibutyl phthalate as a preservative that can cause reversible sperm abnormalities and infertility. So 5-ASA-based regimen is used only in UC for induction and remission. Now coming to our prototype drug, glucocorticoids. So we use prednisolone 40 to 60 milligram per day for ASA-resistant ulcerative colitis. And since ASA-based regimen cannot be used in Crohn's disease, glucocorticoids are the first choice of drug in Crohn's disease. So prednisolone 40 to 60 milligram, hydrocortisone 30 to 300 milligrams per day, methylpred 40 to 60 milligram per day. It is given initially at higher doses, then tapered at 5 milligrams per week, and the final dosage will be 20 milligrams per day, will be achieved in 4 to 5 weeks. Budesonide is a gut-specific steroid given at 9 milligrams per day, given for 8 weeks. The advantage being it need not need tapering. We can use topical hydrocortisone enemas also. The advantage here is it can also act in Crohn's disease with 60 to 70% response rate. But the disadvantage is it has only induction role. It has no role in maintenance. So any patient coming with florid manifestation of UC or CD, start with steroids, but steroids may not be used for maintenance. So you need to add a separate another drug. And I already told you it increases the risk of osteopenia, it increases the risk of perforation in ulcerative colitis, but it does not produce the symptoms of perforation in ulcerative colitis. Antibiotics, the role of antibiotics in IBD is limited. Post-surgery in ulcerative colitis, we create something called as pouch, ileoanal pouch anastomosis. If that pouch is infected, we use antibiotics. The GI antibiotics are metronidazole and ciprofloxacin, 15 to 20 milligram per kg per day in 3 divided dose of metrogyl or 500 milligram BD in ciprofloxacin used. It also has a role in inflammatory, fistulizing, and perianal CD. Why I had to stress this point is, any patient coming with diarrhea, any patient coming with bloody diarrhea, we and the common first point of care physicians have a tendency to start metronidazole and ciprofloxacin without evaluating them. It will reduce the symptoms, of course. So rather than diagnosing and treating the patient in diarrhea, we are treating the patient with an underlying Crohn's disease, and we are making the patient miss the diagnosis for some time. That's why I put this slide specifically. Okay, continuing the main topic, ASA-based regimen, steroids. Then comes the third category, immunosuppression. I already told you steroids have no role in maintenance. So we need a drug to maintain maintenance. So azathioprine and 6-mercaptopurine, usually used along with the biologicals, which we'll be discussing further. Thiocinic acid is the active form for both these drugs. The dose will be 2 to 3 milligram per kg per day of azathioprine or 1 to 1.5 milligram per kg per day of 6-mercaptopurine. Pancreatitis is a complication of both these drugs. It can cause hepatitis also. Methotrexate is an inhibitor of dihydrofolate reductase, also an interleukin-1 inhibitor. It's also an immunosuppression. It is also used along with biological therapy. So if the steroid has failed, you can go for immunosuppression. Cyclosporin, we know it's a calcineurin inhibitor, acts by binding to cyclophilin. It inhibits interleukin-2 production by T helper cells. Remember the pathology which we discussed. So it's used in 2 to 4 milligram per kg per day in steroid refractory ulcerative colitis. So again, I'm highlighting the hierarchy. Ulcerative colitis, start with ASA-based regimen. If it is refractory, go for steroid. If steroid is refractory, go for immunosuppression with the biological. So the side effects here will be gum hyperplasia, hypertension, hypertrichosis, pneumococcus, carinal pneumonia. Tacrolimus, similar to cyclosporin, again is used in steroid resistant ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. So coming to the most important topic as such, biologicals. Since biologicals act in both UC and CD, and they are used in both induction and maintenance, biologicals are now the first line of choice. Because they help in improvement of clinical symptoms, they improve the quality of life, they reduce disability and reduces surgeries and hospitalizations. So we have two major categories of biologicals. One is anti-TNF based regimen and anti-integrins. Anti-TNF based regimen, the time old drugs which we know, infliximab, adalimumab, certolizumab and golimumab. We have 4 drugs. So coming again to the hierarchy, ASA failed, steroid failed, immunosuppression failed, that is azathioprine has failed, go for infliximab. Usually we combine azathioprine with infliximab for better response. So infliximab, the guideline is azathioprine refractory ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. 1/3 of the patients enter remission. So induction is given at 0, 2 and 6 weeks, 3 doses. Following remission, maintenance is given for 1 year with 2 monthly infusions of 5 milligram per kg. The study specifically done was SONIC study. Adalimumab, it has similar response rate to infliximab. UC-CHAM study was a study which was done here. And certolizumab and golimumab are somewhat newer drugs. So since TNF-alpha blockers are in the rise, their side effects are also in the rise. The most important side effect, the feared side effect will be development of antibodies, which can cause 2 symptoms. One, development of antibodies to anti-TNF blockers can cause infusion reactions, which is treated with steroids and antihistaminics. Antibodies to anti-TNF will reduce the therapeutic response of this drug. So the patient who initially was responding to anti-TNF based regimen, who in the later phase is not responding, think of anti-TNF antibodies which have developed, anti-TNF inhibitor antibodies which have developed here. So how to prevent it or treat it? That's why we have to give along with an immunosuppression. So biologicals are not given alone; they are given along with azathioprine or methotrexate to reduce the risk of antibody development. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma can occur when given along with azathioprine and 6-mercaptopurine. We can have hepatosplenic T-cell lymphoma, we can have melanoma, and some skin lesions can occur, optic neuritis, infections can occur. So the malignancies which can occur in the background of IBD are colonic cancer as such, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma due to the drugs, melanoma due to the drugs, and cholangiocarcinoma in the background of primary sclerosing cholangitis. So the first category of biological is anti-TNF based regimen, adalimumab and infliximab. If that too has failed, go for the next category of biological, which is anti-integrin. As we all know, integrin, selectin are needed for the first step of inflammation to happen. So we are targeting the first step, so it is more effective. So alpha 4 beta 7 integrin and mucosal addressing cell adhesion molecule. It's a kind of selectin type of molecule. They are important in lymphocytic trafficking in that mucosa. So if you are targeting this, we are breaking the first step, so it is more effective. Natalizumab is the drug we just used here. Natalizumab, which we know already, IgG4 antibody against alpha 4 integrin. It is given for both induction and maintenance, mainly for Crohn's disease. 300 milligram every 4 weeks is the dose. But before giving natalizumab increases the risk of acquiring JC virus. So JC serology should be done every 6 months in a patient getting natalizumab. Patient on natalizumab should not take any other immunosuppressant. Contrasting with infliximab, which is commonly given with immunosuppressant, natalizumab should not be given with any other immunosuppression because it increases the risk of acquiring JC infection. To overcome these two side effects, JC serology and and the generalized immunosuppression, with natalizumab, we go for another drug called as vedolizumab. The advantage being it's a gut-specific immunosuppressant, can be used for both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Again, by hierarchy, TNF blocker resistant or steroid resistant or dependent ulcerative colitis or CD, we use vedolizumab. Can be used in JC positive individuals also. We induce at 0, 2 and 6 weeks and maintain every 8 weeks, similar to infliximab. 2 trials were run by Gemini 1 and Gemini 2. Another newer drug is ustekinumab, interleukin 12 and 23 blocker. So 5 ASA based regimen, steroid, immunosuppression with azathioprine or cyclosporin or methotrexate, and biological, either anti-TNF blocker or anti-integrin blocker. This is the hierarchy which we go. For Crohn's disease, ASA based regimen has no role. So we induce with steroid and we maintain with an immunosuppression and a biological. That's the ultimate basic. So some newer drugs, as I already showed in the initial slide, any inflammatory marker can be targeted, like Janus kinase, which is targeted by tofacitinib, interleukin 2, etc. There's one newer drug called as biosimilars. They are like biologicals, but they are not biological as such. Like CTP13 has a structure similar to infliximab, but it's not produced like a biological. Ozanimod is an oral antagonist of sphingosine 1-phosphate receptor. It's in phase 3 trial. Nutrition therapy, patient is having some pathology in the gut, so give rest to the gut. Giving rest to the GIT itself will induce remission. That's the importance of keeping any patient with Crohn's disease in NPO. Nutritional therapy is not useful in ulcerative colitis. So surgery, already I touched upon this previously. In ulcerative colitis, the main pathology which we expect is a toxic megacolon, massive bleeding in presentation, and a perforation peritonitis. Crohn's disease, we expect a stenosis or a fistula. So surgery should be targeted specifically. So these are the indications for surgery. So in ulcerative colitis, what surgery we do? It involves the colon. So remove the colon and create an ilioanal pouch anastomosis. We remove the colon and connect the ileum to the anus. That's called ileal pouch anal anastomosis. The complication of this will be a pouchitis. So pouchitis that is treated with metronidazole. The manifestation will be increased stool frequency, watery diarrhea, cramps, urgency, etc. How to differentiate pouchitis from recurrent ulcerative colitis against stool examination for calprotectin. It's managed by antibiotics followed by immunomodulators and pouch removal. Crohn's disease, strictures are common, so stricturoplasty is the common thing. And disease recurrence is more common in Crohn's disease. So even after surgery, you have to follow up the patient in Crohn's disease. Giving medical management along with surgery is more effective in Crohn's disease. Okay, so that's also summarizing everything. IBD should be known in India because it's rising in India. Any patient with diarrhea, any patient with GI symptom, always keep inflammatory bowel disease in the back of the mind, because just by giving metronidazole and ciprofloxacin can reduce the symptom, but we are unfortunately we may miss a diagnosis, which may we may miss a diagnosis in the earlier stage, and treatment is immunosuppression. Thank you. If there are no doubts, we can close the class.
Thanks, bro.